Almost all of what we know about the story of Masada comes from the writings of the first-century historian Flavius Josephus. Josephus was a most fascinating character in history, and his writings are indispensable in reconstructing many of the events surrounding the first century and the Bible. This is quite honestly one of the most fascinating stories I've ever heard, and being at the top of Masada, looking down at that ramp, it's chilling, especially with vivid scenes from the epic miniseries Masada flooding my mind. In a strange way, I can almost feel somewhat of what it was like to have experienced that famous battle and the fate of the Jewish rebels who lived here. I want to begin by recounting the few years that led up to the battle, as we need to set the stage for what was one of the most tumultuous times in Israel's remarkable history. For 100 years, Rome had the Jews under their thumb, and through the years, the Jews mostly tolerated it. But by 66 AD, violence flared in Judea. Meanwhile, Messianic Jews and Gentiles were being thrown to the lions in the arena. Recently, Caesar Nero had the apostles Peter and Paul killed. And Rome was burned to the ground. There was so much blame put on the Jews, who were desperate for God to intervene and overthrow the Romans. A sect of zealot Jews decided to take matters into their own hands, declaring revolution to be God's solution. The Romans were in turmoil. The various Jewish sects were in turmoil. Tens of thousands of Jews were slaughtered, and it all came to a head in 70 AD with the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. With that, the entire world of the Jewish people, along with all hope, had been almost completely destroyed as they watched their precious temple burn to the ground. Titus, with his 80,000 plus soldiers, were victorious, and as many as 1 million Jews died, and numerous others were subjected to slavery.
I am free.
This is the stage that was now set for the events of Masada. In 66 AD, a group of Jewish zealots known as Sakari daggermen, as that was their weapon of choice, led by Eleazar ben-Yair, overcame the Roman legion at Masada and took refuge during the First Jewish-Roman War. Later, after the destruction of the Jewish temple in 70 AD, even more Jewish rebels fled to the desert fortress. It was the last Jewish stand against the Romans, and as such was an embarrassment to Rome, that even though the formidable powers of Rome had recently nearly completely demolished and demoralized the Jews in the war, now they had to deal with these ragtag rebels holding out in this one Roman fort. Rome wanted to make an example out of them and crush these rebels once and for all. Around 72 AD, Romans under the command of Flavius Silva focused on freeing Masada of its rebel inhabitants. Silva mobilized Fretensis X, the Roman legion encamped in southern Jerusalem. Accompanying the Roman soldiers were thousands of Jewish prisoners brought to the encampment to serve as slave labor. The total entourage must have reached a staggering 15,000 people to the foot of Masada. The sight of such a formidable fortification at Masada must have initially disheartened even the most roughened legionnaire. Sizing up the situation, though, Silva put the troops to work right away. To prevent the zealots from escaping, he built a 6-foot thick siege wall erected all around the entire mountain. 8 base camps were established. Silva's camp was on the northwestern side of Masada. From here, he could oversee the construction of his most important siege work, the ramp. According to Josephus, in a staggeringly massive construction project, 8,000 Roman soldiers, using tons of dirt, large stones, and thousands of Jewish slaves, built a massive assault ramp.
It measured 220 meters wide at its base, rose 90 meters, and was topped with a 20-meter stone pier nearest the wall. According to archaeologists, this obscenely large amount of earthwork weighed the equivalent of 1.5 times the Empire State Building. It is stunning to imagine that this was accomplished without the use of modern equipment.
The Jewish defenders attempted to thwart the ramp's construction by rolling huge stones, each weighing close to 100 pounds, down the side of the mountain. Although this defensive action certainly caused serious injury, it was not enough to stop the concentrated efforts of the legion. In a ghastly turn of events, the Romans at one point started launching Jewish slaves up to Masada from the catapults. They said that unless ben-yair and his people surrendered, they would keep killing the Jews. Flavius Silva thought that this was absolutely barbaric and beyond Rome's dignity, so he caused an immediate halt to that, a temporary reprieve, and some sanity for a moment. After 3 or 4 months, the massive labor project was finished. The Romans' next step was to construct a large ironclad siege tower. Amazingly, this siege tower was approximately 80 feet high and featured at the end of the beam a massive iron ram head. Getting the massive siege tower and battering ram hundreds of feet up to the walls of Masada was no small feat. Thousands of Romans and slaves used flat and vertical wood beams to create timber bracings filled with packed stones, rubble, and dirt. They compacted the white chalky dirt of the ramp and hundreds at a time slowly moved the tower up the ascent, all the while having rocks and arrows rain down upon them. As they inched up the ramp and closer to the walls of Masada, they were now more vulnerable to the barrage from the defenders. The Roman legion fired ballista stones from small catapults, mainly from the assault tower itself. Some of these rocks, amazingly, can be still seen today at the top of the mountain. The tower now stood taller than the walls of Masada, and so the Romans sent a flurry of arrows down upon the Zealots. With a desperate, furious barrage from the Zealots, the 10th Legion began pummeling the wall. While the intimidating ram head crashed into the casement wall. When the breach of the wall was finally made, the Romans saw that the Zealots had built another wall behind it. This too was a double wall made of wood built with dirt as filler. The battering ram proved unsuccessful against this wall, for the dirt helped to cushion the blows. Consequently, Flavius Silva commanded that the wall be set on fire. When a north wind blew the fire back into the Roman soldiers, the Jewish defenders believed that God was coming to their aid. However, hope was dashed when the winds shifted to the south and tossed the flames back onto the wooden wall, setting it ablaze. As the wall burned, the Romans decided to retire to their camps and wait until the following day for the coup de grace, the final victory. Nisan 14, amazingly, Passover, 73 AD, came to an end with the Romans dreaming of conquest and glory. As their wall burned and the Zealots had very little hope left, they faced a terrible choice.
If they surrendered, the Romans would crucify them as an example to the would-be rebels throughout their empire. Or they could die fighting and leave their wives and children to rape and slavery.
The Zealot commander Eleazar made a speech reaffirming their belief that God created people to be free. He said in effect, it would be greater for us to die at our own hands than to hand our own flesh over to the pagans.
Since we long ago resolved never to be servants to the Romans, nor to any other than to God himself, who alone is the true and just Lord of mankind. The time is now come that obliges us to make that resolution true in practice. We were the very first that revolted, and we are the last to fight against them. And I cannot but esteem it as a favor that God has granted us, that it is still in our power to die bravely and in a state of freedom.
Having spent several years fighting the Romans and seeing their culture and their temple, their precious temple, destroyed, the freedom fighters agreed with Eleazar. Josephus recorded the tragic events that took place next.
To avoid the miseries that were to follow from their enemies, they resolved on the necessity of doing their own execution. Miserable men indeed were they whose distress forced them to slay their own wives and children with their own hands. The husbands tenderly embraced their wives and took their children into their arms and gave the longest parting kisses to them with tears in their eyes. Yet at the same time, they did complete that which they had resolved on. Not able to bear the grief they were under for what they had done, and esteeming it an injury to those they had killed to live even the shortest piece of time after them, they then chose 10 men by lot to slay all the rest. And they offered their necks to the stroke of those who executed that melancholy office. And when these 10 men had without fear killed them all, they made the same rule for casting lots for themselves, that he whose lot it was should first kill the other 9, and after all should kill himself. Now, for the Romans, they expected that they should be fought in the morning. But when they made their assault upon the fortress, they saw no enemy, but a terrible solitude on every side.
When they went in, they found the Jewish rebels had set fire to their homes. They burned everything of value from the fortress, leaving only their food and weapons. They wanted the Romans to know that they had not died of starvation or lack of weapons. Though Herod built the fortress as a testimony to his own power, it is remembered today as a symbol of the Jewish desire for freedom. Almost 2,000 years ago, these Jewish zealots were seeking freedom from Rome and took their last stand. And the echoes of Masada's past continue to influence Israel today. For many years, army recruits swore their oath of allegiance at Masada, remembering the ancient defeat of the Zealots. They are given a gun and a Hebrew Bible, and they swear to never let Masada fall again. Masada was left untouched for centuries until being rediscovered by two American biblical scholars in 1843. Extensive archaeological excavations didn't take place until 120 years later in 1963. Due to its remote location, Masada has been left untouched for almost 2,000 years. Not only is it an incredibly interesting historical place to visit, with Masada's rugged and majestic beauty truly a sight to behold, but there's nothing like it in the world. You feel very special to be there and to actually be able to go back in time and sort of relive the memories of those amazing Jewish patriots that were there, taking their last stand against the formidable foe of the Roman Empire. In 2001, Masada was declared a World Heritage Site, and today is still one of Israel's most popular tourist attractions. One of the most incredible places to see in all of Israel. David hid from King Saul in the general area of Masada. The text doesn't tell us whether David ever stayed at Masada, but we know that he hid in strongholds like it. The writer of 1 Samuel recorded, "David stayed in the desert strongholds. Day after day Saul searched for him, but God did not give David into his hands." 1 Samuel 23:14. During his wilderness hiding, David wrote beautiful psalms about his trust in God. He used the picture of a desert fortress to describe God's protection. He said, "The Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer. My God is my rock in whom I take refuge." Psalm 18:2. In this psalm, David actually used the Hebrew word Masada. Even if he never stayed at Masada, David had surely seen or heard of its huge size and steep cliffs. As we confront evil around us, we always will find ourselves with enemies who try to break us down. But in the midst of these trials, we can say with David, "My soul finds rest in God alone. He alone is my rock and my salvation. He is my fortress, and I will never be shaken." Psalm 62:1 and 2. In the midst of his troubles, David's Masada was God himself, an unshakable source of protection and strength, and our only source of protection and strength. If we, like King Herod or the Jewish zealots, try to find safety in the Masadas we build for ourselves, we will ultimately fail. For only God gives true freedom from the world's troubles. Thank you all for joining us. Shalom. Nothing missing, nothing broken in your lives. God bless. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, as it really helps.
You want answers? I think I'm entitled. You want answers? I want the truth!